I chart folds for a living. That means I sit in a cold room with a drift array and a headset, and I tell captains where space is thin enough to push a ship through without tearing the ship apart. It is not glamorous work. Nobody writes songs about the man who says, "Turn left here, the seam holds." But it is precise work, and precision was the only thing I had ever been good at, so I kept doing it, moon after moon, contract after contract, until the Toreth Concord hired my relay station to chart the folds along their border. My relay station was a converted survey barge parked at the edge of their system, 3 decks of drift arrays and cold coffee, and I'd been running it alone for 6 years by the time the Concord's contract came through. I liked it that way. Alone meant nobody asked me to explain myself, and I had never been good at explaining myself. I was 44, I had a scar along my jaw from a fold miscalculation early in my career, and I had gotten used to the idea that my life would be measured out in seams of space rather than anything a person could hold on to. That was how I met the Queen. Her name was Sarah Vortoreth, and she sat a throne in a hall built for 100 elders to stand behind her, which they did, every single time I was brought in to confirm a fold reading. She wore ceremonial white, spoke in a voice that was never quite hers, a chorus voice, layered, 3 or 4 registers deep, as if a room full of people were speaking through one mouth. They called it the choir. I was told, politely, on my first visit, that the Queen's mind had been bound to her court's collective will since the end of their civil war, so that no single royal could ever again decide, alone, to burn a system. I was told this like it was a mercy. I nodded, because I was a contractor a long way from home, and it was not my place to have an opinion about another people's law. But I chart folds. I watch instruments for a living. And on my second visit, during a routine reading, the gravitational stress of an incoming fold bloom hit the palace's outer shielding, and for 4 seconds, I counted them, because counting things is what I do. Her voice dropped out of the chorus entirely. 1 register. Hers. She said, "That number's wrong," flat and quick, correcting an elder's miscalculation on my display before I'd even flagged it myself. Then the 4 seconds ended, and the choir folded back over her like water closing. Nobody else in the hall seemed to notice. I did not report it. I told myself at first that it wasn't my business. Then I told myself it was sensor drift, an artifact of the fold bloom, nothing worth flagging in a foreign court's internal matters. But I kept coming back to chart their border, because their space was thin, and folding there was genuinely difficult work. And every time a fold bloom hit the shielding, I watched for those seconds. They were never long, 3 seconds, 5, once, 11, during a bad storm, and in those 11 seconds she told me her hands ached from sitting still so long, which was such a small, human thing to say, that I had to look down at my instruments so my face wouldn't show what I felt. I started doing something I had no real justification for. I started logging the fold blooms as slightly worse than they were in my reports, so the elders would keep me on site longer during storms. More minutes of static meant more seconds of her. I never told her that. I never told her anything, in those windows. What was there to say to a woman who had 4 seconds to be herself before 100 voices took the wheel back? Instead, on my 4th visit, I left something on the narrow table beside my instrument case. A star chart, hand-marked, of the folds along her own border. Not the Concord's official chart, mine, with my own handwriting on it. The kind of thing that belonged to nobody but the person who made it. I didn't explain it. I packed up and left before the next bloom hit. On my 5th visit, it was still there, folded inside her sleeve. I only knew because during a 6-second window she touched it, once, without looking down, the way you touch a thing to make sure it's still real. This went on for the better part of a year. I never asked her what the choir felt like from the inside. She never asked me why a contract cartographer kept extending his stay on a border nobody else wanted to chart. I learned, in scattered 4-second pieces, that she had been 14 when the Civil War ended and the binding law was passed over her, too young to have any say in a decision made to keep her safe from herself. I learned she liked the particular blue of a fold bloom just before it hit shielding, the color that meant, for a few seconds, that the sky belonged only to her. I told her, once, in the length of a single breath before the choir folded back in, that I'd started slowing my own reports down on purpose, just to keep the storms running longer. She didn't have time to answer before the chorus took her voice back, but the elder standing nearest her flinched, as if something in her expression had moved before it could be smoothed away. We built something in those seconds. I don't know what to call it besides that. Not romance, not exactly, not yet. Recognition. The specific, quiet recognition of 2 people who had each decided, independently, that the other one was worth the risk of being seen. Then came the storm that mattered. A collapsing rift had opened along the trade lane between the Concorde and the human relay fleet 3 systems over, the kind of rift that eats ship's whole if nobody folds a safe seam through it fast enough. I was the only cartographer who'd charted that particular stretch of space closely enough to thread it. The elders wanted their own senior navigator to make the attempt instead, using the choir's combined calculation. I told them, plainly, that the choir's math was 6 hours old and the rift was moving. They didn't like being told that by a human contractor. But the fleet was real, and the ships in it were real, and eventually they let me try, on the condition that Sarah, as the Concorde's ranking authority, confirmed the final coordinates allowed, in the old way, before the fold was cut. The trouble was the stress of that particular fold bloom. It was going to hit the palace shielding at nearly the same moment the coordinates needed confirming, and nobody knew what a spike that size would do to a mind that had been bound and unbound in careful 4-second increments for a decade. The elders wanted to delay. I told them the rift wouldn't wait for anyone's comfort, mine included. She was the one who said to proceed. I stood at my instruments when the bloom hit. I watched the register drop out of her voice the way it always did. One voice, then a silence where the others should have been, stretching past 4 seconds, past 11, past anything I had ever measured. The elders around her went rigid, waiting for the chorus to reassert itself and speak the coordinates in the old ceremonial cadence they trusted. She didn't say the coordinates. She looked straight at me, across that whole vast hall full of people who were not looking at me at all, and she said my name. Just that, Cade. Not an order, not a ritual phrase. A word that belonged to nothing but the two of us and the year of 4-second windows that had led to it. I read the coordinates off my own instruments instead, the ones I'd trusted all along, and cut the fold myself. It held. The fleet came through clean on the other side, every hull intact. In the hall, nobody moved for a long moment. Then one of the eldest of the choir's elders, an old woman who had sat behind that throne longer than I'd been alive, said, quietly, that no ceremonial phrase had ever unlocked the Concorde's binding law by accident, and that a name spoken freely, under that kind of stress, by someone the law itself had judged incapable of speaking freely at all, was not an accident either. It was, she said, evidence. The binding law had one clause nobody had needed to use in a generation. Proof of an unbroken, self-chosen will was grounds for release. They didn't strip her crown. She kept her throne, her court, her title. What they released was the choir's hold on the single register that had been quiet for 10 years. When she stood, for the first time I'd seen, without 100 voices standing up inside her at the same moment, she didn't say anything grand. She crossed the hall, past every elder who had spoken for her for a decade, and she took my hand in front of all of them. The way you'd take hold of something you'd been reaching for in the dark far longer than anyone around you had realized. I kept your chart, she said, her voice, all the way through, just hers. I told her I knew. I'd watched her check it every storm for a year. She asked me, then, the first real question she'd ever gotten to ask anyone in 10 years, without 100 other minds answering first, whether I'd stay, now that there was no fold left between us that needed charting. I told her some seams are worth staying to hold.